I'm also incredibly honoured to be sitting here next to Sean Turnell this evening. Almost from the moment that I knew of Sean's story, I also knew that he was someone who I really badly wanted to talk to. And in fact, as a fellow Macquarie University professor, I badgered my own bosses at the university and then got in touch with Penguin to try and make sure that I was going to land a spot on the stage with Sean. Because I recognised in him an extraordinarily intelligent, erudite, and humble man who also went through an experience that really echoed my own. For those of you who don't know, I spent 400 days in prison in Egypt on terrorism charges. And in fact, I do want to acknowledge Macquarie University. I'm also proud to say that another famous Australian prisoner, Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who was imprisoned in Iran for over 800 days, is also joining us at Macquarie University next year. And I'm really excited to say that we'll have our own little nest of terrorists and spies at Macquarie University. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, at least on paper, this is a very dangerous place to be. I hope you've all checked your life insurance policies because you do have on stage a convicted spy and a convicted terrorist. I'm sure Sean needs no introduction, but for the sake of formalities, let me remind you about this remarkable economist. He's, as I said, an honorary professor of economics at Macquarie University, and in 2009 he published an influential book on Myanmar's economic financial system called Fiery Dragons. That made him both an internationally recognised expert and drew him to the attention of Aung San Suu Kyi. And he became one of her most trusted advisors. He was arrested in 2021 in Myanmar after the coup, which is really where we begin our story. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean Turnell. Sean, before I begin with the questions, I'm going to mention that we are going to take a slightly unconventional approach to the story. Rather than walking you through the narrative, which you can read all about in Sean's extraordinary book, I've realised as I went through it that he and I actually have an incredible amount in common. There are so many parallels in Sean's story which echo my own, and I realised that in that respect we have a lot of points of convergence that I thought would be worthwhile for us chatting about. Before we get into the substance, though, I do want you just to briefly set the scene for us and just explain what you were doing for the Myanmar government.
So I was over there to help the reform process. Probably people know Myanmar has been locked away for most of the time since independence in 1948. And we're used to thinking about Asia in terms of the tigers and all that, and strong economic growth, and even when there wasn't democracy, right? We're used to a story of economic success. But Myanmar throughout that period was run by successive military regimes with no real idea at all of what they were doing except staying in power. So the country was desperately poor. In 2015 there were elections. Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been opposition leader for a long time before that, won the Nobel Prize, under house arrest for 20 years, all that. She got into power, and what she wanted to do was not only turn the country into a democracy, but actually try and get it to catch up to the other Asian countries, become the last and best of the tigers, was sort of the mantra that we were running with. So, yeah, so I was over there to help with that. I was there for the election in 2015. In fact, on the morning after that, Suu Kyi said to me, "Look, Sean, you've been writing about Myanmar for all these years. Why don't you come over?" She didn't quite say, "Put your money where your mouth is." That's not her style. But she basically said that and said, "Can you come over and give us a hand?" So, and Macquarie Uni was wonderful in agreeing to that, and the Australian government. And yeah, before too long, I was there in Myanmar, and then spent 5 years with that government, that civilian government, just trying to get things going. Trying to create prosperity, but also very much the foundations for democracy as well.
So there was the coup, tanks in the streets, government overthrown, a lot of arrests of people. You must have known, or you did know, that there was a real chance that you'd be picked up yourself, didn't you?
Yeah, but it was a growing realisation, Peter. And in fact, I think at first I was a little bit complacent. I thought that as a fairly high-profile foreigner, they would leave me alone. Also, it's funny, because now that they've been there 3 years, they seem, somewhat immovable, but we might come to that later as well. But at the time, it seemed like the coup might fail as well, and so this might just be a little blip, scary and all that sort of thing, but it wouldn't last for too long. So I was a bit complacent, I think, at first, and then I was starting to get warnings about, no, Sean, you've got to go. And I started making inquiries, but, by then it was a bit too late.
And you had an email the morning of your arrest.
I did.
Which is an absolutely extraordinary email. I've got to,
Yeah.
I mean, again, I know I said I wasn't going to talk too much about the detail of the book, but this is an extraordinary thing to get up in the morning at 5 o'clock, as you usually did, open your email account just to check and tell us what you saw.
Yeah, well, you know what it's like, right? You get that email that you don't want to read. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, oh, jeez, this is not good. Basically it said, it was a message from a secret friend, and said, look, the military have taken over the hotel. They've got the CCTV cameras focused on your door. It's time to get out. And I thought, oh my goodness. So quickly packed the bags and all that, raced down the stairs to the lobby, wasted an inordinate amount of time paying the bill.
But you're an economist, right? You always settle your debts.
I had to pay the bill, right? And the worst of it is, I got charged. Like, it paid the bill. It took it off the credit card. But in doing that, the police then surrounded me.
But you also made some calls, hadn't you? You called the embassy.
I had
and you
two calls. I called my wife, Harvu, sitting here in the front. She was the first call, I think, and then the ambassador was second. And I said to the ambassador, look, I think I'm going to be arrested. Can you come over? And she did, and then arrived in the middle of this, in the car with the flag on the bonnet and all the rest of it. So the drama sort of amped up at that point, but yeah.
And you were arrested, you were taken into custody, and the first place you went to was the very crowded police station.
Yeah. Full of all young prisoners. So I guess the young generation of Myanmar, we're not going to put up with the coup. They came out on the streets really, really quickly, completely non-violent as well. And in fact, that continued for a long time until the military actually turned on them and started shooting them. But very noisy. And so when I entered the prison, the noise was incredible because there were so many. The cells were really crowded and people were banging and shouting and all that. But yeah, that was the first.
For me, because that's really interesting because this is the first point of parallel, the first point of connection. Because for me, the first people that I went into were also a group of young activists. I was detained in 2013, the end of 2013, and there was a lot of street protests from people who were supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood regime who were ousted in a coup 6 months earlier. And so we had a very similar crackdown, a military regime that was determined to lock up any criticism, any dissent, and they were stuffing the cells with young activists, with anybody who took to the streets waving their fists, saying, shouting down with the coup. And I was also just overwhelmed by how many young, passionate activists there were, and people who were absolutely committed to non-violent protest, and really the cream of the society, the intelligent, committed, energetic, passionate young people.
Absolutely. Just picking up on that, both then and much later, I would often complain, to prison guards, probably not particularly helpfully, that the wrong people were on the wrong side of the bars. Exactly the same sort of thing. Really smart, savvy, internet sort of enabled, even though they just recently experienced all this. But full of passion and all that, and just really, really nice. In the book, one of the motivations for writing the book actually was to pay tribute to these, and a few of them who quite just saved my life basically, but even the ones that didn't do that were just incredible companions and people who I admire to this day, scattered as they are around the world.
It strikes me you got a lot of solidarity and support and love and affection from inside the prison amongst those people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Same, exactly the same for me too. And I think that was because there was a real sense of cohesion and a sense of common purpose in resisting those regimes.
And I think the other thing comes from that too is that and Peter, I'm not sure if this is the case for your situation, but particularly in these early days, I was fairly sure I would get released. And in fact, in those early days, I thought I'd be only there for a few weeks.
Yeah, it would be just a few phone calls, some high-level discussions between diplomats, and you'd be escorted to the airport and allowed to go.
Yeah, but that wasn't the case for them, and yet they were incredibly generous and brave and stalwart in sort of defending me and criticising guards and all that.
You mentioned generosity. You got food items. You got things. You got some help.
Absolutely. So the food diet that you were given in the prison was pretty awful, and these people would turn anything into anything else. It was alchemy. It was incredible. And there's one guy.
Extraordinary creativity.
Yeah, I mean there was one. My main protector, this lovely man called Jacob, or Kin Mong Shui, his name was. But he created a wok out of like a bent bit of iron that he attached some live wires to. I mean, it was the most dangerous thing imaginable. But he baked bread in this thing and a birthday cake. I mean, it was just incredible.
Jacob, and I have to mention this because Jacob fits a description of one of the most extraordinary characters I ever came across, a guy called Allah Abdel Fattah, who was an absolutely wonderful, intelligent, one of the most intelligent people I have ever come across, and I've met an awful lot of very smart people in my career, who also was phenomenally generous. I mean, all of our cellmates, particularly in those early stages, were phenomenally generous. But he gave me some wonderful advice too. He said, you won't make through this, you will not survive unless you're able to make peace with yourself. And before I do want to ask you a little bit about this, but before we do, I want you to finish the story of Jacob, because I think you mentioned when we spoke earlier that there are a lot of people that you wanted to thank and people that you couldn't thank because of the risks. Yeah. But let's talk about Jacob and just tell our audience what happened.
Yeah, so he's simultaneously the most heroic and tragic figure in the book, because his personality was such that he wouldn't put up with stuff and with the nonsense, and he wouldn't put up with what was happening to me either. So he was my main defender. So if a particular prison guard was acting roughly or whatever, Jacob would intervene on my behalf and just get stuck into them. But he'd do it just more generally. He's one of those people who, again at school, the sort of kid who stands up to the bullies and all that. He was just like that, and he was a particularly sort of ornery sort of character, so he very easily made enemies, but over things of principle usually. So anyway, so he was wonderful and protective of me, but after 6 months in Insein prison in Yangon, I got transferred up to Naypyidaw, where I spent a year. And Jacob stayed back, and then when I returned to Insein after conviction, the first thing I asked people was, where's Jacob? And nobody seemed to know until one of the interpreters said, Sean, sorry, Jacob's gone. He's gone already. And my reaction was, okay, he must have got released, because, people were getting amnesties and things like that. And I said, that's great. And they said, no, Sean, he's dead. And then I had to push a bit, actually, to get the story. And again, very characteristically, he'd intervened in a fight in the prison, which I later found out, or the story goes, was actually staged in order to harm him, basically. It took place right outside his cell door. He'd intervened. Then the two protagonists actually turned on him, as did then the prison guards, who beat him and kicked him to death, basically. So, and the worst of it too is that I think his friendship to me and as my obvious protector was, just another black mark, if you like, against him and led to his persecution. So, yeah, so his presence is there in the book. I've got a photograph of his book. Well, one of the nicest things after I come back was that I tried to find out about him, because, I only had the conversations I had with him in the prison, and his brother wrote to me, and that photograph of him in the book is actually supplied by his brother.
It's extraordinary the level of vindictiveness that the system inflicts, particularly on people who are already powerless anyway.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he'd had the temerity to push against this, and just so obviously had a moral authority, I think, which sort of stung the people who quite clearly didn't.
That issue of moral authority, I think, and the sensitivity of the regimes to anything that challenges that moral authority, that there's a sort of desperation almost to cling to anything that gives that veneer of authority, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, I know at some point talk about the legal process and so on, but I think that's behind that, right? Their desperation to cloak things within the law or whatever, like some sort of narrative, which is patently not true, like again and again. And you know, these are regimes built on lies. Therefore, the truth is just something that is so threatening to them, I think.
I was going to come to the theatre of prison later on, but seeing as you raise it, let's talk about that now. I know we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but I do think it is extraordinary the way that there does seem to feel this need to almost to dress a stage for this performance of to give a kind of a sense of legitimacy. Describe your courtroom and that court process. Yeah,
so the courtroom was ridiculous. It was a house basically, which had been used for like a senior administration official before, but they tried to have all these accoutrements of a courthouse. So they had like where it's the dock, isn't it, where the prisoners sit, and they had like a little rail in front that was just one of those really flimsy sort of stands, which you had to be careful if you touched it, it would just sort of fall over. And then there was a sort of crest of arms, sort of blue tacked up on one of the walls, like chairs piled on top of each other to give height, to make a sort of platform for the judge and so on. I mean, it was just, completely ridiculous. And yet, there was just this need to express somehow, well, they actually used against me an expression, the spirit of the law.
Yeah, I wrote that down.
Yes.
Let's see if I can find it.
Why do you look at that, Peter? I should say why that was important was because right at the very end, the judge, in the final summing up and sentencing me as guilty of effectively being a spy, actually agreed with my defence lawyers who said that as a foreigner, not formally appointed by the Myanmar government, I was under no obligation to keep Myanmar secrets anyway, therefore the law didn't apply. He actually acknowledged and said that the law didn't apply, but then said we have to consider the spirit of the law.
Exactly. He said we must not just determine the letter of the law, the spirit of law must also be determined.
Yes.
So it's okay. It doesn't matter what the law says. It's what we think it says that we can convict you on that basis.
Actually, in Australia, we call it the vibe, don't we?
My judge very memorably declared that the evidence showed that we were in league with the devil.
Oh, wow, that beats me.
that well-known legal concept.
Yes.
Let's back up because the thing I guess that I wanted to talk to you also about was some of the psychological strategies of prison, and you. In one passage you say that one way I learned was you talk about time and the problem of getting control of time, particularly when you're in an environment without access to daylight, with no watches, where time is, Einstein's concept of the flexibility of time becomes really tangible. How did you cope with that?
Yeah, so one of the things I noted in the book is actually, but a sensation that I felt very much at the time was how desperately I needed a clock or a watch, even though I had nothing to do, I had nowhere to go, no appointments to meet or anything like that. But it became so important to structure the day. And I think, just put a layer of some sort of control and classification and categorisation of the day. Otherwise, it was just sort of formless, and that sort of fed into your psyche as well. So, I was really desperate for the clock, and I had, I think in the end, about 4 different clocks at various points, which were either confiscated or the battery ran out, or even that was, I remember the deeply distressing moment when the battery ran out. Or actually, even worse, before it ran out, it was going slow, and so I couldn't trust the clock. That was...
And that drives you mad if you can't trust it.
No, Gosh.
In Torah, we didn't have watches either, but of course in the Islamic world you get the calls to prayer, which established routines through the day. And there was, in one cell I had, there was a window high above facing east. And so for a few hours in the morning, I'd get a shaft of sunlight that would leave a shadow. For the bars would have a shadow on the wall opposite, and so I made a crude sundial, because if you could track the distance the sun moved between 2 calls to prayer, and if that was about a 5-hour gap, then you could break that down into 5 segments, and you had roughly a period that you knew was, as I said, a very crude sundial scratched onto the wall. And for me, that became an absolutely vital way of controlling time.
Yeah.
Because the whole point of prison, I don't know if you found this, but the whole point of prison is to mess with your head, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Physically, you're not, as long as you're not being tortured and you've got food. It was never great food, and we can talk about food in a moment, but it's your own head that will eat you up.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes, one of the things that doesn't help, I'm one of those people who voraciously read the newspapers. I need to know what's going on, and I need to have something to do, and every day, some sort of progress, etc. And you're suddenly in an environment you can't do anything. Like, you just stop and stagnate. So dealing with that wasting time, very strong.
Well, I'd just like to read, actually, would you mind reading this passage, please? Because I think this refers to what we're talking about, that one there, that paragraph.
This one?
Yes.
So this is on page 91. Psychologically, the cocktail of fear, anxiety, and monumental boredom morphed readily into self-obsession. Every hour of the conscious day was imbued with real, exaggerated, and imagined suffering. As prisoners, we experienced a complete lack of agency over the most basic aspects of life, an understanding that our fate was completely beyond our control. This was especially difficult for most of us politicals, highly active people used to making decisions, used to being autonomous. Now we were at the mercy of a regime that, outside the prison walls, was going about killing people in order to remain in power. They were all about brutality, irrationality, and dysfunction. And here we were, trussed up for these killers who already identified us as enemies of their Potemkin state.
And so, I guess I did want to ask, how did because you went through periods of depression as well. How did you deal with that? How did you deal with the psychology?
Yeah, so the really basic way, with animalistic way, I think is just to walk up and down, like to move. The worst was actually sitting on the seat or lying, on the ground or whatever. So, so to pace up and down, but really importantly as well, to count. And it became really oddly soothing. All of my Myanmar colleagues were much better equipped at this than me because they could all meditate, and that was really important in their lives. I couldn't. I tried, and my head was just couldn't get in the right spot. But for me, meditation was doing that. It was just walking up and down, counting. Later, I invented games and things like that. But I think, the most basic thing: walking, counting, and you couldn't think. I think that's the important thing about the counting. You couldn't think, and also I think you're getting that layer of control over time, over space, etc. So the illusion of that, I think, added, was a real help.
It's interesting you mentioned meditation. I was lucky because I'd been through a rather difficult breakup a little bit before I wound up in Egypt, and to try and steady the ship, I went and did a meditation course, a Vipassana 10 days meditation course, and that's 10 days of silent retreat, no reading material, no writing material, no talking, no communication. So when I went into solitary confinement, they said, sorry mate, no reading material, no writing material, no contact. I thought, okay, I've been here before, I've got the tools for this. So I can completely see, because I saw people, I don't know whether you saw it, but I saw people going literally crazy in prison because of the pressure of confinement, and particularly solitary confinement.
Yeah, I think it was, again, I think my Myanmar colleagues were just really good at it, because funnily enough, I never did see that. I never saw anyone sort of go, why happy, or I think the expression. But for me, whenever I started meditating, all I could think of, I'm in the prison, I'm in the prison, I'm in the prison.
One of the things that you mentioned was the question of how to respond, whether you respond to your imprisonment with defiance and resistance as a kind of show that you fight back against the regime from inside your prison cell, or do you take the alternative strategy and comply and say that my survival is my resistance? Because you know that if you push back, it's going to cause, there's a very real chance that it will lead to some very bad outcomes. Did you wrestle with that?
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
But, and still do. I'd still second guess my actions on that front, because in some ways I would feel guilty about that, because as a relatively privileged foreigner, so that, you know, the conditions were awful and I got treated badly, but I didn't get treated as badly as my Myanmar colleagues. So I would actually think about that quite a bit, actually, that if anyone should be at the forefront of pushing back, it should be me, because, you know, again, they almost certainly wouldn't kill me. So, yeah, so that, I wrestle with that all the time. And also, one of the things that was most helpful amongst the books, and I'm sure we'll come on to the books, but amongst the books that I was getting, but all, no, not so much the books I was getting, the books I could remember as a kid. I'd grown up absolutely obsessed by the Colditz story, the Great Escape, and all this sort of stuff. And I would remember those stories about resistance and digging tunnels and building gliders and all this sort of stuff. And I was thinking, gosh, I should do this. And then then came the realisation, though, in a country like Myanmar, what would I do once I got outside the wire, right? I mean, I think I would be easily picked up somehow.
Yeah, a small middle-aged white guy in
that's right, wandering around.
Very dark and yeah, I had the same question.
Yes.
And we actually went through, because I know there were some very fierce debates amongst my fellow prisoners as well about the same thing. People were saying, well, you can't, if you're looking comfortable, then you're effectively signalling that you're acquiescing, that you've accepted your fate, that you're resisting. And I always felt that, in fact, if the point of prison is to break you, the best form of resistance is to not get broken. And that given the power imbalance, trying to fight the system was only ever going to mean that you would lose. You can only punch a brick wall for so long before it breaks your hand.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah.
But you said you still wrestle with it. I find that.
Yeah, because well, again, I think it's just because of that relative imbalance that I had with respect to my Myanmar colleagues.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I suppose at other times too, though, I just completely lost it, actually, and I had no rational calculus at all. I didn't care what would happen.
You let fly a few choice expletives too.
Absolutely.
Which doesn't look very Turnell-esque, does it?
No, it all this took place about 2 a.m. I remember one in particular where it was up in Naypyidaw and it was in the middle of the monsoon, the rains are pouring down, and it was a blackout, and so everything, you know, just went completely dark. And of course, the trouble with that is that then you can't read anything, and the cells are filling with water, so you can't even lie on the ground. You've got to hold all your belongings, including books, and just stand there all night. And I'm doing this, and I thought, I just had enough. And so I went to the cell gates, and you're very much not allowed to touch the bars. And I grabbed the bars and I shot them like this and just shouted expletives and questioning the parentage and the various proclivities of the senior general. But I remember just shouting, you can't even make the electricity work. But yeah, and then my Myanmar friends came to see me the next morning and said, Sean, are you all right? Because I never saw that once from them. They never lost it. But yeah, it was about 4 times I think I just completely lost it. Yeah.
Did you ever see any consequences of that?
Not really, no, because I think by then, again, I was in a sort of weird situation where they were very, very careful to not give me any privileges, but at the same time, they were also very careful to keep me alive, and so they were obsessed about that, actually. And I mentioned somewhere in the book that they were constantly taking my pulse. Yeah, so I think for that it was sort of, and also there's a bit of the sort of crazy foreigner, just let him go.
But keeping you alive would have been a huge thing for them, as you said, because they couldn't afford to let you, of all of the, well, perhaps Aung San Suu Kyi, they couldn't afford to let die and become a martyr, but they also couldn't afford to let Sean Turnell.
Yeah. I think that the only trouble with that, Peter, so I was never worried that they would beat me to death or anything like that, but what I was worried, the conditions in the prison were awful, right? So, and probably you experienced the same, that, like, particularly say things like electricity. This Insein prison had been built in the 19th century. It wasn't equipped for electricity, so sometimes the wires were just nakedly running on walls and things like that. So you could easily just electrocute yourself, and there was often, like, you know, drainage ditches immediately outside of doors, and I had a fellow prisoner fall down in one of those and break his leg, and I thought, and you know, and I got COVID 5 times, and you know, I was 56 57 and 58.
But you were the first prisoner to be vaccinated.
I was,
as well.
and I got the Sinovac and then the Sinopharm vaccine, and they did absolutely nothing except give me COVID 5 times. So, yeah, I got 4 vaccinations and COVID 5 times, which says something.
The regime tried very hard to portray you as a spy, as some kind of existential threat to the country. Now, I know you don't look like Jason Bourne, but perhaps that says just the effectiveness of your disguise.
Well, exactly.
You're not supposed to look like a spy.
No. One of the things, I mean, just on that, one of the things that Hara and Phil and I used to do very often before I went over there, we watched the Bourne films quite a bit, and people will recall, I'm sure, that the agents in those Bourne films were always called the asset. Right? The asset is in the nest, the asset is in the car. And so Ha's name for me was the liability. So we used to use that in our correspondence. But I did tell a prison guard once that I wasn't Jason Bourne, he didn't need to put these chains on me.
You mentioned earlier too the kind of the legislative framework that was used to lock you up, and it seems to me that there's a lot of the colonial legacy in that a lot of the laws that you were tried under were colonial era laws. I know that I had the same sort of thing in Egypt.
And probably the same laws.
Quite likely the same
British
laws.
Empire,
the same British Empire, the same legal
Yeah.
foundation. If it wasn't the same specific laws, then it certainly would have been the same basic legislation that had been built on and adapted over the years. But also, I think the same prison, or at least the same prison architect.
Yep.
Because I swear, your description of the gates of Insein, Insein prison were almost identical to Torah.
Yeah.
The big sort of the big arched gate with the smaller gate with the door within the door and the kind of big bolts and stuff. It was like it took me straight back to Egypt.
Yeah. Well, for me, of course, it just took me straight to Lord of the Rings and sort of Helm's Deep, or Mordor, etc.
Do you think that colonial legacy has something to answer for?
I'm not sure, because the colonial legacy in Myanmar is quite odd in its manifestations, actually, because it's Myanmar is one of those countries where, there's not a great dislike of the colonial era, and I think it's because the country's been so badly run since. That there's a lot of hankering of nostalgia, actually, and a lot of older Burmese people I know will openly say things like, oh gosh, we were so much better when the Brits were here. It's an odd sort of situation there. So you don't get that sort of there so much. But the trouble is, of course, a lot of those laws are just very easily bendable into highly oppressive laws, as you'd experience, and including this Official Secrets Act, which in its various manifestations throughout the British Empire is used all over the place to imprison people.
Yes. One of the things that you sort of mentioned was the kind of belligerence of the regime. But I often wondered, I often felt that they were more sensitive to international criticism or to international opinion than they let on. They would never ever acknowledge it, never admit it. But I still felt as though at least in Egypt, that they were more sensitive to it because they want that international legitimacy. Do you think the pressure had contributed to your release?
Oh, definitely. No, definitely. And I think once they convicted me, I think they were then looking for an opportunity to then just boot me out. So they had to keep me a bit longer than we thought. Our big hope was that upon conviction I'd be then just deported straight away, but they kept me for a few more months. But till the next available religious holiday, I think, just use it. But absolutely. But I think the international pressure is everything, actually.
Let's talk for a moment again. Just go back to the people that you were in prison with after you were during the trial, the NLD leadership, because I think we touched on it earlier about the sort of question of resistance and how you fight back. But I think it's worth reflecting a little bit, and I'd like to get your thoughts on some of those people that you were in prison with. The obvious one is Aung San Suu Kyi herself, who comes across in your book as an absolutely extraordinary character, everything that we imagine her to be, and with all of the strength and courage and character that she's portrayed in public. But there are many others, weren't there?
Yeah, definitely.
How important were they to you?
Oh, completely important. And in fact, the only reason why some of them I wouldn't praise more is just because they need to be protected a bit. But we were all concentrated together, all the senior political prisoners, and so it was Aung San Suu Kyi, and it was all the ministerial lineup just about, but particularly the economic ministers. They were all together. But at this point, it gets a bit wonky because we spent most of the time just talking about economics. And there's one guy in particular who was just obsessed about doing economics. And when I knew him in the government, he'd always be carrying a laptop around with him, doing spreadsheets and all this sort of stuff. And except for the fact that he didn't have a laptop, he was exactly the same in the prison. And he would come to me in the morning and say, "Sean, I've got an idea about how we could reform customs." But he remained like that all the way through.
Do you think the fact that they put you in prison alongside those guys were part of an attempt to portray you as part of that part of a kind of wider conspiracy?
Absolutely, and I think it was about what made my situation worse than it would have been otherwise is that they were using me to get at them. And that's a particularly awful thought. Like, you can, in a sense, live with your own ill treatment, but if you fear that you're just being used to get at people who you like and respect and all that, it's just horrible. And then, in the trial, all these documents which are being gotten off my computer and all that were then presented and distorted. To suggest that I was a spy and they were my agents and they were inappropriately giving me all this sort of stuff. But you'd wince when these documents would, be sort of projected up on the screen. And you can see your old handiwork, and it was completely innocent stuff, like, trying to reform this, that and the other. But again, with this whole idea of the sort of criminal justice accoutrements makes it look terrible. It's almost like, cue the tense music at this moment.
But there are even documents that were marked top secret that had been clearly edited while you were in prison.
Yeah. I mean,
after you'd been detained.
This was so absurd. I didn't notice at first because I'm not, particularly technologically able, but one of the other people I was on trial with just identified that there'd been modifications to the document, and it was still written on the screen underneath the document. And it was just so obvious that the top secret had been inserted onto the top of these documents that weren't top secret at all. But
But again, it's all part of the theatre of well, literally the theatre of the absurd, really. An attempt to portray you in a way that legitimised what they were trying to do, even though everybody knew it was a sham.
And they knew it, and they didn't need to do it. I mean, that's the other thing, they didn't need to do it. I mean, why would you? But and it's odd because, I often used to think about, and in fact I even asked, I'm just remembering now, I asked one of the prosecution lawyers about, what do you think you're doing? Like what? And would say to the others about, what do they tell their kids at night after they have a day in this trial? What will they tell them in 10 years' time of that?
We had something, it's interesting because we had, again, very similar, because I was placed, after I was initially arrested, I was moved to another prison with all of the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood government. Literally, when we had the former Prime Minister, Hisham Thandil, up in the cell above me, but next door was the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood. There was the Minister of Supply, the Minister of Labour, the Speaker of the House, Saeed Khatami. I mean, all of the cabinet was there. And we also had some extraordinary discussions around policy and politics and history and so on. And you would also have these sort of big formal discussions almost, like your own classes.
Yeah, totally. We actually called it Barbed Wire University, or BWU. I don't want to sort of suggest too much that it was that highbrow. It was at moments, but it also got down into the scurrilous and latest gossip that we were hearing and so on as well. But because particularly up there in Naypyidaw, we actually had nothing to do. We were released for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon. But in the afternoon particularly, you just wanted to talk, and so people would come out and extol the most extraordinary things, either backed up by reality or not.
an amazing insight too, though, into what they must have been thinking, and you know, some discussions at policy level that you would never have been able to have otherwise.
Yeah, no, and incredible post-mortems, because again, these people were part of that government, and we would talk, long and often on, how the reform process is going, things we could have done different, did we not do this properly, shouldn't we have seen the warning signs here and there, and a lot of discussion obviously around the very opaque story around the coup itself, and whether, again, it could have been expected, whether we could have done anything different. There was a lot of second guessing, particularly from them. Actually, as a foreigner, I didn't really have a role so much in that time, but for them it was a big issue, that one.
Sean, the trial was a sham. You knew that the verdict was inevitable, but how did it feel when you finally got the verdict?
So it was a massive anticlimax. I thought it would hurt, like I thought it would be one of those moments, but it wasn't at all, because the judge came in and he was embarrassed by it, and so he just read it out at top speed so fast that it was almost like, you know how a little kid will sometimes just talk really quickly just to muck around or whatever. It was like that. It was like a parody of something. So he just bolted this stuff out, nodded, and walked out the door. And I looked at the others and I said, well, what happened? And they said, oh yeah, we've all been convicted. We all got the maximum sentence. But it was, it's just so bizarre. But yeah, total anticlimax, because it was over before I even thought it had started.
You were then moved back to Insein for a period, hoping that might presage your release, but it didn't happen immediately. It drew out for quite a while, didn't it?
Yeah.
But then there was a moment, again, I identify with this very, very well, when right out of the blue you were told, Sean, pack your things, you've got 10 minutes.
Yep. Yeah, and it came after, so this is the 17th of November 2022, 16th of November 2022.
Which is just over 12 months ago, which doesn't...
a couple of days ago.
Extraordinary distance you've travelled since then. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, no, on the 16th, the day before, was our wedding anniversary, and I had a conversation with her just about, okay, here's another date gone, and also, it didn't look like I was going to get released then for a few months, and we were speculating about when the next opportunity would be, and that it's a pity that I won't be home at Christmas and all that. We were reconciled to that, sort of, but I, went back to the cell after the call, okay, just got to get through this. And then, the next morning, in the middle of my exercises, trying to do my 10,000 steps, I think I've got in the book the exact number that I got to. And this guy appeared and said, yeah, Sean, good news, you're going home. And my first reaction was, okay, please tell me you're not kidding. And he said, yeah, no, I'm not kidding, but you've only got 10 minutes, you've got to get out. And I had this sort of dilemma about, oh God, what do I do? How do I pack? What do I pack? And I remember I'd pick up a book and put it back down, and pick up a shirt and sort of go to put it on, then take it off again, and just didn't know what to do. But actually the circumstances determined it, because he said, come on, we're going to go. So I walked out there essentially with nothing. But it was very, very odd and likewise anticlimactic, I think.
But you were escorted out to you got on a plane to Singapore.
Yep. So we were all there were 5,000 prisoners.
Sorry, let me just ask the moment of departure. How was that? Describe that for me. I'm sorry.
So it was wonderful, because we were all on this Myanmar Airways jet, and the regime had booked the tickets.
Leaving the prison.
Departure
from prison.
Yeah.
Because that's, for me, that was a very emotional moment, because it was really conflicted.
Yeah. So maybe the same then, Peter, because we had a fear that we might be rearrested as soon as we stepped outside the gate, because that is a practice over there. I'm not sure. I was explained once why, but I can't remember what it was now. But so we were a bit worried about that. So getting into the bus, it was good, but still sort of apprehensive. But as we're in this little minibus, and when I say we, so it was a bunch of foreign prisoners, including the former British ambassador, a Japanese photographer, and a few other dual nationals. And as we're going to the bus towards the airport, the light, our mood is lighting dramatically. but to be honest, I never really gave. I mean, the hubbub at the airport was extraordinary. All the embassies were there, all the ambassadors, the Australian military attaché and all that. And it was all very flash. It was in the VIP part of the airport, and we're all scraggly, and people might have seen the picture of me with this beard, and I just looked like terrible. But it was sort of, it was giddy, I'd say, is the word I would use for it. Like not really being able to process it, feeling vaguely happy, unsettled, worried, but sort of a little bit of euphoria thrown in there as well.
But also scared to feel the euphoria.
Yeah,
just in case something weird had happened, because very difficult to process.
And I remember one of the things, because one of the books I got in the prison was Kylie Moore Gilbert's book, and Kylie's book talks about how when she got on the plane, how they popped the champagne, I think it was popped the champagne, or celebrated or something when the plane left Iranian airspace. But I couldn't do that because it was Myanmar Airways flight, and so I'm still on Myanmar property. But I do remember, as we're flying from Yangon to Bangkok, looking down and seeing, I knew straight away it was Thailand, because Thailand has the agricultural patterns there, as everyone would know, as long strips rather than sort of square patterns of agriculture. And I thought, aha, that's Thailand. We're coming. Because there was also a fear that went around us that we were actually just going to another part of Myanmar, that we weren't going to overseas at all. And then the bright lights of Bangkok. And I thought, wow, that's not Paul Yangon. That's a big city. It really wasn't till the tyres hit the ground in Bangkok that was the moment where it was sort of, okay, now I'm free. Fantastic.
There's a wonderful moment to hand it over to our audience for questions. We do have a roving microphone, ladies and gentlemen. If there is anybody that has a question, please raise your hand. And I would ask you just to keep your questions brief. We've got a gentleman over here, the blue shirt. If you could just keep your question brief and to the point, I'd be very grateful.
I've had very little exposure to the country that you were persecuted by, but I was in the Golden Triangle in the early 1970s and was made aware of the racial strife between as I recall, the Lisu, the Lahu, etc., and the Chinese refugees. And they were all busy fighting each other and fighting the central government. Why? What underwrites the instability in what is now Myanmar?
I mean, it's a mixture of things. A fight over resources. Myanmar is a little bit of a constructed country. I don't want to go too far on that ground, though, because well before the British, there was a sort of central state which was very much dominated by the Burma majority and with other ethnic groups already subjugated within that. So it's partly a fight over resources. But above all, I mentioned, Burma being controlled by successive military regimes who would brook no opposition to them. So Myanmar sort of missed the opportunity. There was a famous treaty that took place in 1947, just before independence, where there would have been a very good, or what hopefully would have been a good federal sort of structure that would have granted substantial autonomy. That was never allowed to develop. Probably as people here know, Burma got off to a terrible start of independence. Just before independence was about to take place, the natural leader, who was Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, was assassinated, along with half the cabinet. And so the country was pushed straight into civil war, almost from the word go. So the sort of conflict's been there for a long time. But yeah, it's a bit of a fight over resources. It's a fight against the regime. A little bit of foreign interference, big influence from China, from Thailand, other places as well. Religious differences have a factor as well. Obviously, the terrible atrocities taking place over the other side of the country in Rakhine State, the genocidal activities against the Rohingya. So, so the conflicts are there. I mean, to end this question on a happier note, amongst the younger generation, both that I experienced in the government, then in the prison, then subsequently, if you look at the opposition groups now, some of those issues are much less problematic. There's a new generation of young people in Myanmar who are so impressive, but above all, they're impressive in this way. Probably like our generation of young people, they're genuinely colour, gender blind. I mean, it's extraordinary, actually, the degree of cooperation. But, so I'm sort of hopeful, actually, on that front, more than the past.
Any other questions? We have a question. There's a gentleman down the front here, and then we'll go to that gentleman over there. Have we got the microphone? Just down the front here.
In both of your cases, were there any guards that you thought were really nice and you kind of missed them and wish to keep in touch with them?
Sean, people that you missed.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. There were some guards who were nice, yeah.
Guards.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So there were some horrible ones as well, of course, but but there were some that were nice. There were some who were just frightened. And also, there's no economic opportunities in Myanmar now. So many of them were desperately poor, very badly educated, had no real options. So in other words, I don't think I encountered a single believer in the regime. And I think that's what separates the Myanmar story from many others, including Iran and places like that. So they were there to survive. They were cynical, but some were playing the game for advancement and for income for their families. But many of them, because of their own distaste for the regime, they would be quite nice every now and then. A lot of the younger ones would, as soon as they got to work in the day, they would take the uniforms off and don English soccer jerseys. And that gave me an opportunity, actually. I remember just trying to rack my brains about, God, what do I know about Manchester United, about Liverpool, just to have that sort of level of contact. But, yeah.
It's interesting. I found a lot of the guards, I came to think of them as much prisoners of the system as we were, because they were, as Sean said, in Egypt they were so economically downtrodden that they were trapped whether they wanted to or not. They were there. Now, that's not to say that a lot of them weren't complete assholes who were, had a really nasty sadistic streak through them. But there were an awful lot of them who, and you could see they were as poor as anybody else. Their shoes were falling apart. They relied on the same food as the prisoners, which was pretty horrendous food, to be honest with you. They'd have to spend, they were working 12, 15, sometimes 16-hour shifts, and they'd sleep on thin mattresses outside the prison. So in a lot of respects, what they were putting up with, the conditions that they were putting up with was every bit as harsh as we were. Now, I'm not saying that they were exactly the same as us, but what I'm saying is that I actually came to see them and regard them as kind of creatures of that system, as products of the system, as trapped in the system. And I figured out how to make sourdough bread, and I used that as a way of currying favour by giving them some of the bread as well. And there are a few guards, not a lot of them, but one of the prison officers who I would like to have another conversation with over a cup of tea. Yeah. There's a question over here. That's it. The gentleman.
Hi, Sean. Hi, Peter. Hi, Sean. Particular to you, just want to ask, how did you stay hopeful during this prolonged period of imprisonment? I mentioned you talk about creating games, counting, and then working back and forth inside the box. But staying there for such a long time, 600 days and over, how did you survive? How did you manage to keep yourself, hopeful, positive? And the second question is also in terms of hope. Do you feel our country, Burma, how do you feel about it? Do you feel hopeful for the economics, considering the situation back home? Thank you.
So going to the first one, so to some extent, keeping despair at bay is the first thing you do before you hope. And so I mentioned the counting and the walking and all that. The other thing that, there's a couple other things. One is that I knew what was happening outside. So again, every few weeks I could talk to Harsh, he could tell me what was going on. And so I knew all of Australia was rallying behind me. And that was incredibly important, because I don't think at any point did I ever feel abandoned or anything. And again, I juxtaposed that to my Myanmar colleagues who had nothing like that. So I always knew that, and that made me feel good, actually, and not alone. I would think about that. So that was a very, very strong part of it. The other thing, the books were absolutely critical, because all my life books have been everything. And now they returned the favour and saved me. And they were great books. They were, you know, Lord of the Rings, Hamilton, everything you can imagine. Strange books that somehow were managed to be smuggled in, George Orwell's 1984 and things like that. Yeah, so partly it was that too. Also with a bigger, like pulling back a bit and thinking, okay, this will end. And when it ends, I'll be able to write a book and I'll be able to have a book event like this. So
thank you for being part of Sean's therapy.
That's right. But please don't wake me up anyway, just in case.
That question of hope is a really interesting one for me, because I actually, and I don't mean to be a downer on this, but I came to see hope as toxic. Because for me, hope is the cross your fingers strategy, right? It's where you kind of, it emphasizes the difference, the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And so many times, for us, I hoped that our arrest would be over in a matter of hours, if not, or days, if not hours. I hoped that the trial, we'd never get to trial, the charges would be dropped when the investigators realised there was nothing in it. I hoped the judges would see it was just a stupid thing and throw the whole thing out. I hoped that we'd be acquitted. I'd hoped that we'd get short sentences, you know, at every stage of the process, hoped getting dashed. And that was really debilitating. That was really crushing. Until I realised that, and I don't, again, this is not quite as serious as it sounds, but I abandoned hope. Not in the sense that you give up, but that you recognise that the only thing you can deal with is what's immediately in front of you, rather than wishing for some outcome that you have no control over. And so for me, it was about shortening my horizon and saying, okay, that my reality is this box right here in front of me right now. That's what I got to deal with. And whatever I might wish for, it's something I can't control. So it was about dealing with that box, whether it was pacing or inventing a game or figuring out how to cook sourdough bread or whatever. That was the space that I could control, and that's what I needed to deal with. So I gave up on hope, not in the bad way, in the sense that you completely give up and quit, but realised that actually hope isn't serving me very well.
The second issue, I think, you're about for Myanmar itself.
Yeah.
So obviously no confidence at all under this current regime about the economy or anything else. But the good news is, over the last few days, last few weeks, that regime is now looking shakier than ever, both when you look at militarily, but you look at the economics of it, you look at what their only economic program is to try and extract as much foreign exchange as they can. That's about it, in order to buy armaments. So they're in a desperate strait. And so for that reason, I'm maintaining a little bit of confidence that, yeah, maybe the end is near.
We've got a few more questions, ladies and gentlemen. I am aware that we are now technically over time. If anybody has to go, I'm not going to get upset. I think the organisers, we've got time for one, maybe two questions. All right, we've got quite a few hands going up too. So let's take the lady down the front here. We've had only men so far, so we need to balance things out a little bit.
Thanks very much, and you know, you both so, I don't know, it sounds a bit trite, but inspiring wonderfully, yeah. I'm wondering if either of you, this is probably a silly question, I don't know, in terms of the books that you had, you know, been able to access to, did you have any psychology books? And if so, what were they, and was it useful, or what did you learn, or, I don't know. Yeah.
So I had one that, but actually this is a question to the audience. I don't know where, I don't know the psychological literature, so I don't know where this book sits. One book that I had was M. Scott Peck, The Road Less Travelled. I do remember having that. Another book that was floating around the prison, it wasn't one of mine, was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and yeah. But apart from those, I didn't have any psychology.
I had an extraordinary book that still stays with me, and I still draw on from time to time. Man's Search for Meaning. There are a few people. Hands up who's read it. Yeah, an extraordinary book, and I'm embarrassed now. I've got a brain fart. Remind me who the author was. Yeah, Viktor Frankl. That's right. Frankel, just an absolutely amazing book. And Frankel, of course, for those of you who don't know, was a survivor of 4 of the Nazi extermination camps, the death camps. He was a German Jew. And he wrote Man's Search for Meaning as a way of trying to understand the reasons why people actually survived, the psychology that they had. And for me, that was a very, very powerful book. I'm a bit wary of some of the sort of more modern self-help books. But this one I would thoroughly recommend. It's a very short book. If anyone is interested in it, one of the key messages for me that I really took home and really worked with was that he said that life isn't about it's not about the meaning of life. It's about how you answer the questions that life asks of you. It sort of returns the agency to us, because he says basically it's futile to try and understand what the higher purpose is. It's about how you respond to these things that really matter, and I found that incredibly powerful. One more question. The lady up the back there, yes.
Just hearing that a keen sense of humour may have helped in your survival as well. But my question relates to when you're placed into a situation where the proceedings are in a different language. Within the prison is a whole different language and culture. I'm just wondering what that was like, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that one. So, again, it's one of the... I address this in the book because I wasn't proud of my strategy on this front, which was, once I entered the prison, I decided that I would answer nothing unless it was expressed to me in English. So I pretended I couldn't understand what I was being instructed to do. And that gave me a little bit of power back, which was, and it forced my captors, in a sense, to try and tell me what to do in English. So, so I had that. But the trial itself was largely incomprehensible. I could follow bits of it, but it was in a very different version of Burmese than I would be used to hearing. The language itself was again, not the sort of standard Burmese that I could understand. So, so it was sort of problematic, but it was a little bit protective as well, to be honest, because sometimes you just didn't know what was going on, and that was sort of helpful. Sometimes,
ignorance is bliss.
so it was a mixture of things, that one. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me no pleasure at all to say that we have to wrap this up. From the number of hands I could see, I know that there are still a lot of people with questions. That's always a good sign. So many times we get to the ends of these things and nobody really sticks their hands up. So we are now, I'm going to invite you to join us in the bookshop where Sean and I will both be signing books. I'm sure if you have a few questions, we'll be able to have a chat briefly there. But until then, please join me with a very, very warm thank you to Sean Turnell.